Sailor's Psychology, a Methodology on Self-Discovery Through the Tale of a Semite in the Squall by Chester Litvin, iUniverse Inc., Bloomington, Indiana. In memory of my late mother, Paulina Gemelfarb, and my father, Mac Lipinoff. Introduction. Who we are. In my practice as a psychologist, I observed the pattern of miraculous transformation in people who were able to solidify their identity. I was enthused to write a book about the people's spirit. I see people as sailors on the voyage to find the self. Sailor travels inside of his psyche. My hero is a fictitious character, a sailor with a solid identity. His psyche is a collection of fragments that represent the different experiences. The sailor discovers and identifies his fragments. He is on the journey to unify his fragments. Many famous psychologists with different views on human nature, including Heinz Kohut, Murray Bowen, Carl Rogers, and many others, recognize that the main goal of psychological development is building a solid identity. We as sailors do not need to pretend that we are somebody else. We must know who we are and accept all of our fragments. As emigrants from radicalized collectives, we were deprived of the discovery of who we are. The radical collectives use brutal force to impose their point of view on us. They split us from our internal feelings and focus on exaggerated externals that are characterized by grandiosity and pomposity. It is not a truth that the poor get radicalized more easily. The radicals can be part of any society, poor or rich, peasants or aristocrats. The wishes dictators Joseph Stalin did not have any noble blood. Catherine de' Medici, mother of French King Charles IX, orchestrated the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre to kill Huguenots, French Calvinist Protestants. All radicals want us to be their servants and follow them while they impose on us distinctive mannerisms and pretensions. They split us from congruent oral, visual, and kinesthetic stimuli and feed us pervasive stimuli. They distort our vision with a model of zealot without any love of self, like a robotic device serving the radical causes. They put in front of us enormous paintings, monuments, and constructions glorifying collectives. They do not want us to hear any messages of our uniqueness and want us to be indistinguishable fighters for their radical cause. They encourage us to attend parades and marches, just being part of a crowd. They are conditioning our brains to provide the pervasive responses. All our fragments become rigid and inflexible, and so we are left with few or even none of the neutral fragments that can provide impartial responses. Radicals change our brain chemistry by supplying our brain with pervasive stimuli. Instead of keeping our individuality, our domineering fragment leads us to be a servant of distorted doctrines and unproven theories. Our brain chemistry changes and we become deficient in the objective responses. In the big proclivity, with a lack of neutral fragments, we do not have the opportunity to reject any pervasive stimuli. Our brain structure becomes similar to the brains of addicted, impulsive, and psychologically distorted individuals. In the same manner as mental illness, the radicalized collectives create distortion in the brain's function, ingeniously using the incongruent stimuli to control the masses. The pervasive phraseology freezes our logic, and we get confused and powerless. It causes incongruence in the release of our brain chemistry. Instead of being individuals, we become a crowd with identical responses. By incongruity of stimuli, people can easily split us into throngs, mobs, and packs. Only by restructuring our brain chemistry with congruent realistic stimuli that emphasize our individuality can we reject the pervasive phraseology. When we query the exaggerations and question distorted doctrines and do not embrace the unproven theories, we can sail inside our psyche. Without any misleading mannerisms and pretensions, we can achieve the internal unification of our fragments. First, we learn how to respect our fragments. We can guide the self to value our experience as individuals and be proud to be individuals. We embrace our uniqueness. The tools of restructuring are the internal dialogues with our fragments and negotiations with others around us. As sailors, by going on voyages inside our psyche, we create connections between our fragments. Instead of rigidity, we bring flexibility in processing the stimuli and bring congruency in our responses. Our mission in life is to unify our fragments and to resist external splitting. Our goal is to keep our individuality. We unify our psyche in the solid identity, and we do not need to pretend. We accept the self and are happy. We become sailors, and our voyages through our experiences are pleasant. The mind travelers are sailors. To understand our mind and create a comfortable self, we get on the voyage that is, in many instances, pleasant, but sometimes can result in trauma, particularly in a radical collective where everything directs us to be analogs. We are discouraged to explore our psyche. We can be hurt if we do not obey the draconian rules of radical collectivism. The radical collective does not want us to know who we are. For us mind travelers who want to reach our destination, the question of who we are is important to answer. When we answer this question, we are sure of the self and know that we are unique and special. We fit the environment around us. We are well adjusted and happy with all of our endeavor. The fewer unanswered questions we have about ourselves, the easier our interpersonal interactions. We see others as unique and special. However, when we do not know who we are confused misfits. We are a mess and can hardly function if at all. The vagueness about the self is a barrier in our interpersonal interactions. The mystery and secrets of our past drain our energy and our creative juices. When we do not know who we are, we feel tied up as if we are paralyzed. Some of us do not want to know who we are. We are afraid of self-analysis because we can discover the can of worms, the damaged mind fragments, which have become deep secrets and are split by resentments. They are afraid that secrets can get out, and they do not believe that they can deal with these resentments. These minds are endorsing splits and detachments. By splitting our mind, we created the chance for future splits and detachments. The piles of unresolved splits do not bring relief and only accumulate misery. We get healed when we unify and resolve splits. The split is only helpful when our lives are in danger because it helps us to survive. Otherwise, we need to resist splits. The battle between split and unification continues for our entire life. The desire to be an individual is an inherited quality in our psyche. Everyone who is pushed to be homogeneous feels resentment. Part of our personal freedom is to have identity. Nevertheless, when we want to be like others and when it is done voluntarily, it is accepted. These people choose someone's role to follow. Few do it of their own free will, but many are victims of brainwashing and are tricked into becoming a copy. Even some who enjoy the originality of psychology do not know to achieve peace between their own fragments. The real meeting with the self is a moment of recognition of our uniqueness. Through genuine dialogue and real meetings, we can have the unification of our fragments and also achieve balance in our psyche. We call it utopia, but inside our mind we have a place for utopia and fantasy. We have a strong desire to unify our fragments, to balance our models of expression, and to see our dreams come true. The modes of expression are visual, oral, kinesthetic, and olfactory. When we have balanced the mind, we can easily translate different responses to different modes of expression. Our facial expressions, voices, and body movements are congruent. The balanced mind provides the self with peace and tranquility, keeping our psyche unified. Our mind can provide us with feelings that all our wishes achieve, and we reach our deepest desires. Only inside of our psyche can we create utopian relationships. Our mind is a place where we can achieve infinite glory and many personal aspirations. We can create the individual heaven inside our psyche. Even radical collectives cannot impose limitations on our thinking if we really resist. To achieve our wishes and see our desires in real life are commendable, though it gets more complicated when we impose our power on others. We cannot hurt others, but as a result of our actions, which are based on irrational thoughts, others can get hurt. We are pushing others to take defensive responses. They cannot allow the carrier of the irrational self to hurt them. We have an obligation to stop our abusive behavior. The main point is to limit the irrational self and to prevent hurting, exploiting, and humiliating. Our mind plays tricks with our perceptions. When loose fragments affect us, we cannot correctly analyze the pervasive data. As negligent parents, we see the self as adequate. If we are thin, we see the self as fat. If we are fat, we do not believe that we are grossly overweight. Those discrepancies between individual perception and others are not easily resolved. Sometimes we do not consciously understand that we treat others as objects. In many instances, our mind does not care about others and wants to change others to our liking. But we have a responsibility to contend those irrational urges and restrain our antisocial fragments. In those complicated structures, we trust the objective experts' opinions to see discrepancies between our perceptions and others. When a kinesthetic mode of expression is out of balance, the main symptoms are anger, anxiety, and tension. With visual darkness comes fears, negativity, and depression. The oral imbalances bring schizophrenia and paranoia. When the olfactory mode of expression is out of balance, the imbalance signifies organic problems. The imbalanced psyche has a lot of splits, and as a result suffers from the feelings of misery and despair. It cannot build resistance to danger and is vulnerable to split and radicalization. The carriers of radical structures push their ideas on imbalanced psyches. The manipulating of others and using them as an object does not make our goals nice. In analysis, we have to identify what fragment is responsible for our antisocial attitude. In our mind, we could enjoy many of our goals, but we could not allow the release of antisocial responses. If we have conscious awareness of our antisocial tendencies, then we can modify some of our behavior. By balancing our responses on oral, visual, kinesthetic, and olfactory modes of expressions, we can get control of our responses. Every mind can get a self built on its likeness. Many have thoughts of infinite glory and desire to send the self on a special mission to save their ethnicity, their religion, or the world. As soon as the self gets out of our mind and pushes others to get violent and attack, the self is radicalized. It seems that radicalization affects our self the same way parasites affect our bodies. The radical ideas are always there, but for some reason in different locations they are more powerful and quickly spread. The infected self has a different perception of all our basic values. The radicals reject the 10 Commandments, and the most common harm is that radicals do not value the gift of life. The radical ideas randomly affect the world's population like viruses. Too many of us get sick with radicalism and spread infection at an epidemic level. Those infected become the puppets and recruits. Nevertheless, some are immune to the viruses and may become leaders of resistance or victims. The few antisocial people exploit the epidemics to increase their power, using weaknesses of ailing mentality to their own advantage. They promise protection, remedies, and justices, and they appear to be givers, but they are actually vicious takers. The good thing is that viruses do not stay forever, otherwise we would all be dead. In time, people build resistances to viruses, and the epidemic passes, but a big margin of the population is already damaged by the disease. The radical ideas pass as well, but the damages are tremendous. The individuals with a solid identity have an antidote to manipulation by radicals, and they keep their mind immune. They are unaffected by deadly viruses that are polluting our brain with unproven radical theories. By building a solid identity, we get stronger and build resistance to radical ideas. In my book, a fictitious character has a solid identity and is immune to viruses of radicalization. Like my hero, the mind travelers are sailors, building a solid identity as individuals. They are not the puppets of untested doctrines and have a goal of unification with harmony of universe. The emigrants from the collective are sailors and resist split. The split changes the psychological structure and imbalances our brain chemicals, and we produce pervasive responses. The split from harmony leaves us helpless in front of invasive, untested assumptions. We see around us many people who are split and radicalized, and they stopped being individuals. They radicalize in groups and also in imperial collectives, and as radicals, they are always afraid of something. They split in groups with a desire to clean up their surroundings from blacks, Jews, heretics, and other perceived issues. They also split into collectives to clean up the Aryan spirit or to get rid of exploiters, the wealthy, infidels, aristocrats, and more. In reality, the split to small and big is always a desire to achieve hegemony. Splitting is very difficult to recognize because the architects of the split declare that all the atrocities of split are necessary for survival. Our psyche is based on the summary of our responses and is built from our impression of oral, visual, and kinesthetic stimulations. The redundant responses are rigid fragments in our psyche, whose main functions are unification and splitting. The splitting creates a lot of pathology. If fragments conflict and are loosely associated, our psyche cannot serve us adequately. We split when we are not happy with the self or others, and when others are not happy with us. To be an individual, the sailor unifies his psyche. It happens that several of his fragments split from the rest of his psyche and are rigid. By encouraging dialogue, the sailor is able to transform his rigid fragments to flexible. He uses the dialogue as a tool to unify the psyche, and he enjoys meeting his fragments. His psyche becomes whole, and he successfully deals with psychological pathologies. By using dialogue to unify fragments, people who suffer from mental problems can reduce the intake of psychotropic medications, or in some instances stop using them entirely. The unified psyche is well adjusted in life. People with a whole psyche enjoy the interactions with others, and others feel good about them. The sailor has a solid identity and is immune to splits. The duality between moment and eternity can be understood through dialogue. Subconsciously, our desires drive us towards dialogue. We want others to understand us, but the others want us to understand them, and we do not know how to connect. To bring our point across, we use confrontation and manipulation. Nevertheless, the desire for dialogue and meeting is as strong as sexual desire. The drive for dialogue starts in the mind, brings physical pleasure. It can make us part of universal forces and can make us whole. Our desire for unification works in many different ways. We can have the meeting with the universe through a deity. We can encompass the unification with the universe by meeting others. Our mind is part of the universe, and meeting with the self is unification. Through dialogue, we can have an understanding of unity and connectedness. In ourself, we create harmony. To prepare others to connect, we negotiate. Successful dialogue and negotiations create unity. On the other side of the coin, the unsuccessful dialogue gives us physical discomfort and separates us from the universe. After the split, we get fixated in a little space, and our responses lack congruency. Because we are in restricted space, we build our psychological structure with what is available. Our fixated responses and inability to change our rigidity are the result of unsuccessful dialogue. Many times we feel we are failing in our dialogue and feel frustrated and angry and confused. We do not know that we may have an internal dialogue. We wrongly attribute the successful internal dialogue to unsuccessful dialogue with others. When we do not recognize the internal dialogue, we trigger splits in our psyche. We are not able to understand that we have a successful dialogue with ourselves. We pursue failure in our interaction instead of good feelings. We are sailors, travelers inside our minds, and through our perceptions we explore the deepest oceans of life. We need to understand our internal world. Instead of conflicts and violence, we strive to enjoy peace of mind. The goal of the mind travelers is to make their internal world a better place. We can change our perception through our brain power. As emigrants, we are mind travelers with the goal of arriving at a desired place, in the new destination, because everything is different. We go through a cultural shock. Things that were negative in our home country become positive in the new one. We need to change our perceptions. As real sailors and mind travelers, after a strong resistance, we switch to the new mentality and to the new perceptions. People move to faraway places to find happiness. Because they are sick and tired from internal struggles, they change the old scenery to something more comfortable. In the new beautiful place, they have many positive feelings. A few never settle down and constantly travel the world. In the self-analysis, sailors can travel inside their psyche and meet their fragments. Their analysis starts with the identification of fragments, and they do not want to ignore any of them. In supportive surroundings, sailors deal successfully with their splits and achieve a balanced psyche. Instead of traveling to different countries and distant mountains and oceans, sailors achieve more by having a mesmerizing voyage in the interior of their psyche. Sailors know that their confrontation and manipulation result in a split of psyche, and they do not use them. They understand that people use confrontation as a way to impose their perception by force. Some people need manipulation to achieve their goals with tricks and lies. Sailors feel resentment towards bullies and con artists, and they never use manipulation or confrontation to bring their point across. They are aware that only antisocial people feel good by achieving goals through those negative methods. By traveling inside their psyche, they achieve a balanced life, hold many dialogues with various fragments, and have many negotiations with others. They never get disillusioned with dialogues and do not use confrontation and manipulation. With the deity, we always have dialogue and meeting. The deity knows everything about us, and the relationship is easier than with others or thyself. The deity is always whole and is everywhere, inside and outside our psyche. In a dialogue with the deity, we cannot fail. We always can talk to divinity. The deity has knowledge of our thoughts and secrets. The dialogue with divinity is completely different from a dialogue with others. The deity is much stronger and is wiser than we are. It does not have parts or pieces. It does not matter whether the deity is inside or outside of us. Everything around us is connected with it, including fragments, the self, and others. Through a deity, we have strong ties to religion and scriptures. The dialogue is internal and also external, and it comes without any conditions. As immigrants, sailors do not know the language and lifestyle of the host country, but they adapt. In the meantime, they intuitively have dialogues and meetings with their fragments, adjusting their ways to the expression into the life of their new country. They build a connection with others based on their subjective translations. Eventually, they display the transformation and multiplicity of self. Emigrants are mind travelers and show very clear signs of unifications and splits. It happens that in countries of origin, the emigrants were placed in various collectives. Some collectives had flexibility and allowed the citizens to keep their own perception. Others applied a uniform identity to everyone and restricted individuality. These restrictive collectives were easily radicalized. They had draconian rules that prevented citizens from having their own perception. The radical collectives were against any members who wished to explore their internal world and wanted a single, easily controlled identity for everyone. Now, sailors want to have their own perception and to travel away from the land of standardized robots. Sailors, as mind travelers, are not taking a trip on the water by big or small ships. Some do not even have the physical strength to overcome the commotions of being on the open sea. Still, if sailors have inquisitive minds, they can start a fascinating voyage. They do not explore real rivers, seas, and oceans, but they survey the interior of their psyche. They accept as their individual reality whatever they can see in the deep sea of life. They want others to allow them to have their own perceptions. When their individuality is restricted, the sailors revolt. Upon arriving at a new homeland, sailors' psyches get locked, and they get confused and disoriented. Their responses are not congruent with new stimulations and are exaggerated or inadequate. Unfortunately, the traveling routes do not bring them to their desired destination. It is as if they have gone for a very long ride in a car that turns only one way. It is impossible to turn their vehicles into another direction, even though much better routes are still available. The maps are useless because sailors cannot change their roads. Those rigid responses are called fixated fragments, and they cannot use flexible brain passes. As a result, sailors' responses are not congruent with stimuli. Sailors named the fixated responses by the names of familiar personalities who display similar traits when responding to stimuli. Their goal is to unlock the psyche and to have the responses be congruent with the stimuli. The fixated fragments in people's psyche are produced by the repetitive and similar responses to a variety of stimuli. It's like a broken record producing the same tune for different songs. People do not have a conscious awareness of their repetitive behavior when they display obsessions, impulsiveness, overreactions, or underreactions. In order to identify responses, they need to bring them from their subconscious to the conscious awareness. People can manage their responses when they are identifying their fixed fragments. Only through meetings with their fragments can people achieve the transformation of fixated fragments to be flexible. Without conscious awareness with what fragments they are interacting, people cannot change any responses. The goal of self-analysis is to transform the fixated fragments to flexible ones, which allows sailors to have flexible routes. The best way to respond to stimuli, which are the shortest paths to sailors' destinations. The sailor's desire is to have responses that are congruent to stimuli. The sailors engaged in self-dialogue expect to find congruent responses. The split fragments have access to sailors' memories. The loose and somehow detached fragments do not have anything to do with the multiple personalities. They are part of one personality and can be united in the whole identity to help sailors with congruent responses. Good feelings about their responses bring self-dialogues and meetings. Our psyche has a variety of ways to process stimuli and provide responses. We have fragments on different modes of expression. We translate the stimuli and responses between different modes by using the universal translator in verbal form. The different modalities hold different types of information. Our capacities to relate to the self and others vary because of the various ways of accepting and responding to the information. We do not have all modes developed equally. A few of our modes can be less developed, and we cannot quickly analyze and respond to stimuli. We compensate our weakness with more adequate means of expression. When we cannot have balanced replies, we exhibit overreaction or underreaction. We deal with these modes of expression by having balanced responses. When stimuli and responses are translated, we initiate a dialogue and a meeting between the fragments. Sailors know their internal world, and they understand the self. The internal world colors their perception of the external world. To understand the external world, sailors use the measurements and quantifications through their senses. To understand the external world, sailors use the measurements and quantifications through their senses. They see the beauty and the ugliness of the world through their perception. Their inner world can be changed with the power of their mind. Our external world is very hard to measure and quantify objectively, but sailors' inner world fill up with projective data. When sailors gather more data, they can change their perception of the external world and change their fearful and angry responses. The dialogue with others is an external dialogue. This dialogue happens very rarely because we mistake our internal dialogue for external. When we come to different countries, we have many splits and disappointments and settle in a new reality to have many dialogues and negotiations. Often we are failing. Over and over again, our feelings represent one loose fragment that takes control over our psyche. We cannot repeat the dialogue with others and get frustrated and confused. We fail because we do not know what fragment represents our psyche and which fragments represent the others. In times of confusion, the self-dialogue is very desirable and rebuilds our strength. If we do not have internal dialogue with our fragments, we are not consciously clear about what it means to be whole. Self-dialogue and meeting are possible because our fragments know everything about the self. As a result of the dialogue, our fragments get united. Contrary to intuitive dialogue with others, we as sailors consciously have the dialogue with the self. To achieve self-dialogue, we identify and meet the fragments. Contrary to self-dialogue, in the dialogues with others, we do not have the same easiness. Dialogue with others happens rarely, and the difficulty in dialogue and meeting with others is rooted in our incomplete perception of others. Our successful interaction depends on inner strength and the wholeness of the self. Our identity is a subjective perception of the world and depends on our ability to explore and interpret external objects, although it does not mean that we manipulate others as objects and allow others to treat us as objects. We need to admit that, unfortunately, we do not know too much about others, and they do not know much about us. We are limited in our experiences. No matter how hard we try, we cannot see what is going on behind us. When we turn our back, we lose sight of what is in front. We also cannot read the minds of others. However, we are far from being ignorant. If we have some idea about what is going on in the minds of others, it does not mean that we are connected enough to have a dialogue and a meeting. In internal dialogues, we correct our perception of others. The minimization of the complexity of having dialogue with others can be damaging to our psyche. In the worst failing, dialogue with others can trigger confusion and our desire to push out perceptions on others. By being confused, we can use confrontation and manipulation. We can display splitting when loose fragments take over the psyche. As a result, we cannot function without bullying and cheating others. As sailors, we will never act on those urges. We engage in self-dialogue. Our psyche is in the place where our mind and consciousness are located. The self is inside our psyche and is built on our individual perception. Our self is as multifaceted as our identity and our psyche's structure. The significant characteristics of self are individuality and uniqueness. By unifying our fragments, we get a whole identity and a whole self. With splitting fragments, we have a fragmented identity and the rift in self. The reason we do not have a self-dialogue is because of the lack of our knowledge of ourself. We want to have a dialogue with others without meeting our real self. We can unintentionally have intuitive feelings about the self and have dialogue with others, but it cannot happen very often. In general, the failure to know the self results in splitting and distress. The split causes severe disturbances in our normal functioning, such as mental and physical illnesses and general unhappiness. To counteract the split, we meet with our fragments and unify within ourself, which is the way to bring us to a balanced life. We enjoy our own perception and feel whole. From others, we cannot expect the same reaction as we have from our own fragments. As sailors, we respect different perceptions and do not impose our perception on anyone. To lessen the gap with others, sailors use the art of negotiation, which does not require a similar perception. With few exceptions, sailors can negotiate everything with others. The desire to have dialogue with others is very strong, and we feel miserable when we fail. When we're so focused on external dialogue, we often fail to seize the opportunity to have internal dialogue with our fragments. Note that we can copy the other as a fragment in our psyche. Actually, we can have in our psyche a fragment of anyone and still have an internal dialogue. The dialogue with the fragment does not give such strong satisfaction as dialogue with a real person, but by having dialogue with a fragment, we avoid the split from an unsuccessful dialogue with others. By using internal dialogue, we keep our psyche whole. As sailors, to avoid splits from the interactions with others, we negotiate with others our non-matching perceptions. This way, we narrow our perceptual differences. The split in our psyche can possibly be a result of psychological trauma, which is caused by external mistreatment or heredity. A split weakens our desire to have a dialogue. When we are treated as objects and become manipulated and confronted, we do not want any dialogue in meetings. Others feel discomfort in dealing with us because of the split in our psyche. When we split, others say that our psyche fell apart. When we get unified, others perceive us as being together. We have a balanced life and we need to unify our fragments. To be happy with the self and feel that others are happy with us, we use self-dialogue. Sailor psyche has many fragments. Their fragments have a common goal, to look for their well-being and to have unrestricted access to their memory data. The domineering fragments take over sailors' entire psyche, but the dialogue between their fragments is still possible. By opening self-dialogue, sailors remedy the splits and promote unification. The internal dialogue stops rigidity and creates plasticity. When sailors have a difficult time creating dialogue with others, they are not frustrated. Instead of external dialogue, they can always have internal dialogue. Internally, sailors have achieved utopian harmony and they unify all fragments in a balanced identity. They consciously identify their fragments and have internal dialogues. Through identification of fragments, they have more understanding of the self as a complex entity, and they know it is a collection of many fragments that together are their identity. Instead of having external dialogue, they copy images of others as fragments into their psyche and have internal dialogues on familiar territory. To solidify their identity, sailors have external negotiations with others and internal self-dialogue with their fragments. The others cannot easily accept sailors' perceptions because they are unique. Sailors do not easily accept someone else's perceptions. To bring their perceptions closer to others, sailors have lots of negotiations. Before sailors have successful external dialogue with others, they have a successful dialogue within their own fragments and self. Only when the sailors have a solid structure and the responses are flexible will external dialogue happen. Sailors' solid identity can meet others' identity. The similar perceptions cannot be the result of brainwash, manipulation, or forceful imposition of alien ideas. After many negotiations, when two sailors with solid identities have a dialogue, they have a meeting. When we travel to the magic place where we can unify our fragments and be whole people, we are sailors. During our voyage, our mood changes and we become dissimilar. It happens because our mood is taken over by diverse fragments, the small parts of our psyche. We need to know our fragments to know who we are. Our goal is to find the self, resist splitting, and unify our fragments. As sailors, we get through many storms that split us away from our way to reach the internal Shangri-La. Nevertheless, we are searching for a place where we can enjoy our life, and we want to be whole, to unify with the universe. We are analyzing the forces inside our psyche. From early childhood, we continue to discover who we are. The first discoveries are that we are human and our gender. Then it takes our whole life to discover the rest of our complex psyche and our unique self. We want to unify the self to be whole because the psyche becomes more fragmented when our self splits. Note that after each split, our fragments become more rigid and create rigid responses. And when we split, we become more detached from the universe. Sailors make the rigid fragments flexible again. This dynamic continues all of their lives. Unification and splitting are the main forces inside sailors' psyches, and their experiences depend on the understanding of how to interpret their feelings. The interpretation should get them closer to reaching their goal, which is building a solid self and becoming unified with the universe. When fragments are unifying, sailors feel whole and content. When their fragments are split, they feel discomfort and misery. As a result of their own experiences of unification and splitting, they get their individuality. Our mind is unpredictable, and apparently the sailors need to mobilize all of their knowledge to go through the volatile areas. When they eventually unify their self, they feel as if they can relax in a very comfortable pond. Every mind traveler is an emigrant and sailor. His mind goes through immense turbulence, and he needs a military ship to survive the large waves. Knowledge about the self helps him to find his appearance and form his behavior. A sailor's mind is like a crew united under an experienced skipper. The fragments are part of command, and every fragment knows its duty. The domineering fragment is the central commander who unifies other fragments. The unified mind can successfully overcome severe crises with minimum losses. Sailors' minds work the same way as a military ship, with sophisticated technology, keeping our internal Shangri-La protected from any intruders. The emigrants were urged in the past to rely for protection on collective, but now they are far away from the uniform setting, and they are responsible for the self. To be safe, they keep the sailor's spirit. The loose fragments create disarray in our psyche, and we appear hopeless and confused, responding in inappropriate ways to different crises. It is a signal that our identity is a fragmented and split self. We lost the touch with knowledge of who we are. To regain the sailor's spirit, we need to unify our fragments and regain our solid self. As sailors, we need to know our inner self on the conscious level. We have a responsibility to preserve our identity and to project the public image. The famous artist probably can dress as a homeless person because the creativity of the artist's spirit is higher than the judgment of others. But often an artist wears a very elegant jabot shirt with a red tie. In major corporations, employees do not deceive others, and everyone dresses according to status. The managers do not necessarily wear a tie and three-piece suits, but they dress nice enough to distinguish themselves from regular colleagues. The manual worker does not use dress shirts with ties. He prefers jeans and flannel shirts. Our mind is a complex entity and can have many sides. We choose one domineering fragment to represent us. Our appearance and our behavior are congruent with our identity. When we have a solid psyche, we immediately know how to provide the effective response to a variety of stressful situations. Sometimes it's hard for us to identify which fragments are splitting and which are unifying. It gets very confusing when we have external split from something very powerful. Let us assume that we are members of an organization that is respectful and solid. Nevertheless, as insiders, we bring to light the misdeeds in those structures. On the surface, we separate from powerful structures and appear to be split, but it is not a correct observation. We unify with internal feelings of honor and responsibility. For us as sailors, the process of the internal unification is more important than the external split. The internal unification is one of the ways to build a solid identity. On the other hand, for criminal psyches, the unification with antisocial tendencies is more important. Their external unity causes the split from the internal feelings of decency and humanity. When sailors are dealing with the abnormal, violent, antisocial, and criminal psyches, in order to achieve future unification, they can split from their belief. The fragments or responses can be on visual, oral, kinesthetic, and olfactory modes of expressions. The different abnormality in sailors' psyche can be explained by loose and dissociative fragments, and they are incongruent to different modes of expressions. Severe trauma, strong sensitivity, explosiveness, and many other abnormalities can be easily explained by interactions between fragments that are in a state of splitting or unification. Many personality disorders and affective disorders are easily explained by rigidity and incongruence of fragments on different modes of expressions. The process of unification and splitting inside our psyche results in feelings of well-being or misery. The process of unification starts with identifying different fragments. We assemble our fragments in groups that pull together splitters or unifiers. We also need to identify what mode of expression the fragment belongs. Our internal analysis also includes the identification of the level of the fragment's rigidity and flexibility. The process of healing transfers the rigidity to flexibility. Underneath the flexible and rigid fragments, we have the tracts of neurons and synapses. All of our responses have physiological bases, but we are checking the psychological effect. The rigid fragments have the same response to many different stimuli. In our life, the rigid, fearful responses form on many non-fearful stimuli. The rigid responses have a high intensity that causes overreaction. The flexible fragments have the capacity to choose from many responses. We can distinguish stimuli by the severity and form appropriate responses. It means that as sailors, we do not overreact. Sailors do not get in fights or get numb if stimuli need a verbal response. They also translate stimuli and responses into different modes of expression. The feeling of fear and anger can be processed in many different ways, which creates a flexible approach to their responses. Superficial knowledge of who we are is responsible for the lack of intricacy. Because of our lack of internal connections, we do not get what we deserve and satisfy ourselves with much less than we are worth. We bring our internal feelings to a conscious level, and then the connections start with the identification of who we are. To have the ability to connect, we need to do some work to unify our fragments in the whole self. Our fragments can be rigid or flexible. The flexible fragments associate with unification, and the rigid fragments have splitting tendencies. To get an easy connection, we unite our fragments and have a solid psyche, using dialogues and meetings to transform the rigid fragments into a flexible one and then unify them. Sailors find the ways of relating because they know who they are. They know to whom, when, and how to talk. In the crucial moments, the appropriate flexible fragment takes over their psyche, and the successful connection is guaranteed.